Hey gamers, welcome to another episode of Bonus XP. Today we're talking about Fire Emblem Path of Radiance and Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn. And with me again, I have Professor Bopper and ActualLizard, almost like they didn't leave from when we did the Sacred Stones episode.
Help, I haven't left in a week. I've been trapped in this Discord call. Get me out.
Get back in your closet! Welcome back, my friends. I will probably save the introduction because for some reason I have a feeling that this conversation is going to go on for a while, because if you listen to our Sacred Stones episode, you might have noticed how we were pretty split on Sacred Stones and Path of Radiance probably being our favorite Fire Emblems. I know at one point, if you asked me, I would say that Path of Radiance might be the best of the Fire Emblems. Pretty bold statement. But I want to hear what you guys think. Let's go ahead. And Lizard, why don't you start us out?
I like Path of Radiance. It's like maybe fringe top 5 for me. It's like probably 5 or 6 on my list. It's pretty fun. I like the story. As you may guess from Sacred Stones being my favorite, I kind of like the easier games in the series. The difficulty doesn't bother me too much. And we're going to get into this later, but I love the bass in Tellius.
How about you, Bops?
I just love Path of Radiance. For me, this is fringe top 1. Because, and like what Lizard said, I don't mind the easy difficulty. I don't really consider a game's difficulty to be very paramount to its quality. I don't think a game being easy or hard really kind of says anything about it. I just think that this game's so fucking good.
Yeah.
I don't have any other way to put it.
One thing I want to touch on too, I don't necessarily think that the game is innately easy. I just think that with the systems they created, it's exploitable, and that's kind of what makes it easy, right?
I gotta push back on that a bit, because exploiting it is just give all the BEXP to any unit.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
You have beaten FE9.
It's funny we talk about it because, see, and this will get more into the differences between the two Tellius games, because I'm playing the game right now on stream, randomized deployment. I spin a wheel every chapter to see who I deploy, and it was like chapter 12, and I just had enough bonus EXP to take risks from level 9 to level 21, and that used less than half of what I had.
Oh my
God. I hadn't even completed the BXP requirements for every map. I'd done it for most of the maps, but not all of them.
Was I just an idiot when I played this when I was a kid? Because, like, I was like, oh yeah, everybody's gonna get a level or two of the main people that I'm using.
I think that's how it makes sense to use it at first. Like, you play Path of Radiance and you're like, I'll spread out the bonus EXP and that'll be nice. And then now I play it and I'm like, I'm going to promote Soren. The chapter bonus EXP unlocks.
Yes. And then it snowballs, because when you get your units out of control with BXP, then you complete the maps faster, then you get more BXP, and the later maps give even more BXP, and you're like, and there isn't really a drop off for leveling up, so everyone gets out of control really fast. Now, your problem wasn't that you were stupid, it's that, well, it's in your name. Hey, RPGaymer, you had RPG brain. You might need this later. If you use it now, you might need it later.
I need to save this. I need to bank this. I'm not using this silver sword if it's chapter 10. I'm not using this until chapter 27. This
and
is
then
a good one.
Here we are on in-game, and my in-game inventory on Ike is Ragnell and 4 silver swords. Looks like I needed it later.
How do you have 100,000 bonus XP saved up? No.
I needed it later.
Well, I think one thing I really like about this game, I don't know if this is completely true, but is this the first one where main cast isn't royalty? Like, up to this point.
Gaiden is like kind of both and neither.
Celica's
and
there,
so,
but
is,
not-
so is Ike, kind of, right? Like, if
Yeah.
we're counting Alm, then Ike counts.
Yeah,
True.
and I feel like both Alm and Ike sort of do the thing of, okay, we're technically this, but we're going to reject it because that's an important part of the story. And, you know, what it's doing is rejecting
I would
royalty
I would
in a
say,
sense.
like, this and Gaiden, and I guess Robin, right, are like one of the only ones where they are not presented as a noble.
There's just something really special about this narrative of being like this humble mercenary group that gets in the throes of things, as opposed to, you know, this prince who's been dethroned, who's trying to get their kingdom back, or trying to prevent the invasion of another kingdom. I think this was the first time I really felt like, you know, yeah, Lynn, of course, we get chapters 1 through 10 of the prologue, but after that, you know, when you get the full rest of the story for FE7, it is pretty much just the usual. But I felt like this was the first time it was a very different approach on how the events unfolded.
Yeah, I mean, don't you only even know about... does it ever come out and tell you that Ike is, like, probably descended from nobility, or do you have to infer it from, like, Soth's description of the Four Riders? Because the reason is because Grail was one of the Four Riders, and Grail was one of the Four Riders, and prior to Ashnard, that meant you were a noble.
I mean, I feel like that's reading so deeply into it too, though.
And is that Radiant Dawn where Soth describes that? I can't remember.
But I'm trying to remember, is that the only thing people infer that from, or is it said somewhere else?
I think it's the only thing that people infer that from. Even
Then
just a
yeah,
quick
I think
search
we
of
can
if
count
I guess
Ike
royalty,
as, like,
yeah.
the non-noble, if that's the only mention of it.
Yeah, and then the only thing in Path of Radiance is, like, they really try to make Alencia Ike a thing, but Ike ships himself with Soren, or you can ship him with Leth and destroy the fan base, and it's like, it's all over the place, and it's not really, like, they get in with the royals, but it's like a purely business relationship because we're at war. So
Right, like you are the stomping ground along the way of the war. Like you just happen to be in the way. It's kind of similar to, I'm not sure if you guys have played Valkyria Chronicles.
Yes, it is very good.
Great game. But it's kind of the same basis in that way too, right? Because you just kind of reflect what this small country does that's in between two greater countries at war.
Yeah, I really like Path of Radiance's story arc. One of the benefits of not being involved with nobility, especially at the beginning, because even if we say Ike is royalty and we find that out from Soth and Radiant Dawn, we don't know that at the beginning of Path of Radiance, and neither does Ike, so the story starts very much of the land. We're in Ike's little circle, the small sphere of influence that the Grail mercenaries have, and the story starts to expand outwards and outwards and outwards, because the biggest problem, a huge problem I have with a lot of Fire Emblem stories and a lot of fantasy stories in general, is the opening info dump. You know, Genealogy does it, Sacred Stones does it, where it's like, here's your 8 countries and here's the royal you're playing as, and by the time it's relevant, you're like, who the fuck is this and where and who and why? Whereas Ike, being so small, we are naturally fed more information as it becomes relevant. So I love the way the scale of Path of Radiance balloons naturally with our hero.
Yeah, it's kind of like a good paced Dungeons and Dragons campaign where you start small scale to not overwhelm your player base, and then, like you said, you expand more from there, because God, there's nothing worse than just an hour lore dump. And Bopper, I know you've been playing Final Fantasy 16, right?
I've been playing Final Fantasy 16, and I've also played 1 through 7 whilst playing through 16.
So, like, literally, the fact that at the end of every segment, there's someone that just, like, lore dumps more of the world on you. It's just not enjoyable. So yeah, the pacing of the narrative of this game is great and digestible, which is nice. But I think one of the reasons why it's so strong too is just because of the characters. Like Ike is a great lord, and the Grail mercenaries as a package overall, like you're big on character feel, Bopper. Like how would you feel about this cast on the small scope versus some of the other ones in the games that you see?
I really like this cast a whole lot. I think it has, from a gameplay level, it has a really good mix of it's very similar to Sacred Stones. We talked last time about how Sacred Stones, almost everyone except the Jagan is a project, and that's pretty much the case here. And we have a really big variety of different, types of characters, and I think the game does a very good job of letting you get to know, especially the early characters through the story, but even like later characters. This is one of the rare games where when we get to the late game cast, your Bastions and Joffreys and Lucias, especially Bastion and Lucia, I'm like scrounging for deployment slots. It's like, I want to use these people as well. Whereas in most games, I'm like, they're late to the party. I don't really care. I don't know who they are. But in this game, it's like, Bastion just showed up. Oh man, I got to use this guy. He speaks in iambic pentameter. He's so tough. Trying to find like a place to get him in there. And
the characters, like I think what you're saying is, that are just a lot more interesting throughout. I think one of the first things that's really cool too is, once Grail passes, and you have Titania and Soren. They are such a foil to each other, but they're also such big forces on Ike as the narrative goes on, where you have someone like Titania who is more of a loyal peacekeeping do-goody, and then you have someone more like Soren who is more the survivalist, where he might be the first person to say like, fuck them, I don't want to help these people, we just gotta survive and keep going. And I don't think you see that very often in a lot of these narratives for Fire Emblem, where it's usually like, bad guys go kill, you don't have the voices that are telling you like, this is a really bad idea, let's not do that. And Soren is a great developed character.
Yeah, I think one of the things I really like about Path of Radiance, and this is part of why I think Ike is such a strong lord in the series, Ike is not just a good character, he makes all the characters he interacts with better and more interesting. Like, Soren is really cool on his own, but people always talk about him with his interactions with Ike because it elevates both of them so much, at least for me. And I think that's a mark of Ike being a really good lord, that there's so many characters where I'm like, yeah, they're really interesting. I remember this cool conversation they had with Ike.
Now, Bopper, you just launched your support video, right?
Right.
And one of the things you talked about was kind of like how not fluid support conversations can be, in terms of like, especially for the newer games, how it just kind of becomes a text dump. How did you feel about the conversations in Path of Radiance? I don't remember.
Well, I have the least interesting opinion in the world, which is that Path of Radiance is the peak of supports in the series, both on like a gameplay level, how they're attained, and then also on a writing level, because this is at a time when every character didn't support with everyone. Soren only supports with two people,
really important. I think that's
makes
so
perfect
important.
sense.
It does, because he's not going to like everybody. So of
yeah.
course, why would he build relationships with everyone?
And part of the effect of that, and I'm blanking on the one in my head, the example, I wish I could remember it, is that there are some supports are not stable in this game. There are some that do change somewhat depending on who's dead, out like in the cast outside of the two supporting partners. So it isn't just that you get two characters and their C support is just them gimmick dumping on each other. There can be like these small little changes within the supports, even if they're sillier. And this game does have a pretty good mix of support tones, and then also, again, the fact that you're not getting a million of them means that you're not seeing... because like people who are fans of Three Houses and Three Houses characters are like, oh, people don't give Bernadetta or people don't give Leone a fair shake. And that's because a lot of times with those characters, your early experience with them is seeing the same gimmick be played out 6-7 times in a bunch of different C supports. Whereas in Path of Radiance, you'll spend 5 supports with one character. It'll never be repetitious, and you get a much better and fuller sense of their character. And the fact that it can change with the world is only more in its favor.
Yeah, it's kind of like the characters in something like Three Houses are very one note through the crux of their supports until you get onto the further levels, where immediately off the bat in Path of Radiance, we are seeing developed characters coming in already. And since none of the characters feel too much alike, seeing how they interact with each other and how they could build off of that. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, speaking of characters, I think one of the other big shakeups that made this game really interesting are the Lagoos. And I'm probably gonna get a little canceled for this, but like when I first played this, I hated using the Lagoos because they were just so different. Like they weren't a familiar approach. And again, this was in their game. I had this at launch. I played this at launch. And I found it really hard to digest mechanically how to fit them in, but narratively, I think they were great. How do you think incorporating this different unit style really changed this game, and why do you think we didn't see something like this in future installments?
I do not love the Lagoos from a gameplay perspective.
Probably for the same reason that I didn't when I first played, right?
I feel like, so you have the ones where the cat gauge, or was it the cat gauge in this one? You have the ones where it's ready right away, right? Like Leaf transforms right away.
Cat's ready right away.
And those ones are fine. I don't have a problem with those ones. But I really hate the Lagoos where the meter's not filled and they just are shove bots until the meter is filled. Because like most FE9 maps, until you get to the end game, don't even take that long. So I'm just like, okay, you're just here to shove people until I have enough of the consumable or the equipment that makes you be a unit for the whole map. Mm-hmm. So I feel like there's just a bunch of units that I don't really get to use because I'm just waiting on their gauge before I'm allowed to do things with them.
Yeah. And the fact that they don't promote and their level ups are basically like +1 strength is basically +2. So like they all have the reduced EXP yield, so you just get less dopamine hits from them.
You're definitely right about the not promoting, because I don't know what Fire Emblem player doesn't enjoy a promotion and how good it feels. You know what I mean?
I mean, when the only other character in the game that gets EXP at the same rate as you do is Soth, Path of Radiance Soth, that does not feel very good to use.
Okay, well, I guess I don't feel as bad about how I felt.
Yeah, because they get pretty overhauled in Radiant Dawn to make them more playable.
Because I'm sure they didn't love that, like, the best thing a Lagoos does for a significant portion of POR is be able to shove mounted units.
Yeah.
Like, that's the claim to fame.
And, like, you can get it to work better, but, like, the fact that you can't have them get into combat untransformed to fill up the meter faster. There's no Olivey grass. Lagoos stones are kind of rare. It's just a whole mess. It's really a bad situation for the Lagoos. And there are some Lagoos in this game that I've never deployed. I've never deployed Renoff or Ulki or Janaf ever.
Oh,
a single
the
time.
Dancer is cool, though. I like how the Dancer
cool.
works in this game. Because there, it's like they do stuff before they transform, and then they transform, and you're like, oh, baby, now I have a 4-way Dancer.
Yeah. Well, and that's great because they do stuff, and then they do cooler stuff instead of do nothing and then do basic stuff.
Exactly, yeah.
From a narrative standpoint, based on kind of what we were talking about before, do you think one of the reasons why this game is so strong also is because, like, it's almost a game about racism in a way? And that is, like, one of the big undertones throughout the game, where usually the Fire Emblem narratives are evil spirit kills things, you defeat it, bye bye. Where this one had a little bit of political intrigue, but it also had, like themes built into it, and that's kind of like the vehicle of the Lagoos.
Yeah, like, and I don't want to, like, Path of Radiance's racism, like, metaphor is ultimately, like, it's a simple one. It's a very basic fantasy thing. But when you consider the audience that this game is for, I mean, we're all adults sitting here talking about it, but, like, this is a game for 12 to 15-year-olds,
Right.
would probably be, like, the market. It would be, like, that's your intended audience. And so I think, honestly, the fact that it's a pretty simple and easy to get, like, metaphor, for an audience that's probably seeing these themes displayed in media for the first time, I think it works. Like, this is, for a lot of people, this could very well be their introduction to this kind of metaphor and to these issues, depending on who they are and where they live. And
for some people, it's To Kill a Mockingbird. For others, it's Fire Emblem Path of Radiance.
Exactly.
I think, obviously, it's great to have, more nuanced takes on these issues. But I also think it's good for there to be pieces of media that just tackle it in a straightforward, don't be racist manner. It's good to have both of those things, I think.
It is, especially when you consider the audience, because I would never want, like, a 13-year-old's introduction to be, like, really advanced level stuff. I think it's very good to have these introductory level ideas.
But it did make some of the characters
games
a little bit more interesting, too, because if you factor in a character like Jill, I mean, I know, I agree with you, like, this is definitely thematically watered down. But
this is not a criticism that I'm saying, by the way. I don't want anyone to get the impression that I'm criticizing the game for being fairly basic.
Oh, no, not at all. But, like, some of these characters do come across as a little bit more interesting. We always tend to have those characters who are the bad guy last or final hour character join, like Vida in FE7, who just happened to join because blank. And this time I feel like we had a lot more characters, especially like the Dayan folk who were jumping in, like Jill, and I think it made them more interesting because we got to see their struggles of like what they're fighting for and where they align with you and where they don't. It almost kind of reminds me of characters that you see when you're playing something like a CRPG, like Baldur's Gate, where you might do things in the world and it's going to change how they reflect around you and what they stay with you or not. Now obviously, like, that's not happening in Path of Radiance because you don't really get that choice, but it's just interesting seeing these people join you but not completely agree with what you're doing. Okay, Lizard, I know one thing you want to talk about that is pretty big for you was also the addition of the bass in this game. Do you want to elaborate on that?
It's so good. So imagine everything that makes like the monastery cool in Three Houses, because I'm a bit of a monastery defender. You get like the cool conversations with your units that are topical to what's going on in the game. You have all of your armor and item management you can do. Now take that, put it in a menu. You have the base. It's incredible. It takes 2 seconds. It gets right to all the good stuff. It doesn't waste your time. I love it.
Was this the first time that we saw foraging too?
Was this the first time we saw foraging? Yeah, right?
It should be. Yeah, because Gaiden doesn't have it.
It comes back in DS. Gaiden didn't have it, right? That was an Echoes edition.
Yeah. And
pretty sure, yeah.
Yeah, the closest you have is like genealogies, like blacksmith repairing stuff, but like that's not anywhere close to this.
No. Yeah, I think a streamlined experience for a hub is a really great idea, just to not have to disappear and go somewhere else just to have a conversation with a character, just to get a weapon made is huge. I do feel like a little bit it does take away from world building in a way, but I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing either, because I think, especially when we were talking about Engage, we said like one of the big struggles is how much they try to achieve and what falls short. And here it's just like, no, it's here. Like, don't even worry about it. Focus on where we have focused on more on other things. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'm actually gonna disagree ever so slightly on the world building
fucking
point.
Dare you?
On the world building point, because I think, like Lizard, I really like that you point out, like, you get the conversations, like the monastery conversations with the other characters are great. What I love that Path of Radiance does is it strips that down to a handful, so that you get like 3 or 4 conversations with units or with random people around the towns, which I think is a big one. The problem with the monastery, to me, from a world building perspective, is that all things converge at the monastery, whereas in Path of Radiance, our base is not a location that's fixed. We move from place to place, so sometimes we're having conversations and supports and info dumps in villages, in crumbling castles, and royal halls, out in fields. And then some of those info conversations are with villagers. They're with knights, they're with random guards, they're with spies. And so it really textures the world. I think there's a lot less of it, but it does a lot more with a lot less, because those unwritten textures, the locations and the NPCs we encounter, I think add a lot more depth than returning to the same location really can.
Sorry, I would agree with that, yes. That is definitely a downside of the monastery that you don't get in the base.
Do you think that's something that we can appreciate moving forward through the series as opposed to working backward? Because I wonder, for someone where something like Three Houses or Engage or even any of the 3DS titles and work their way back through the series would see it in the same perspective.
So I don't know, because the thing is, I complain about hubs all the time, but people really like them. So, like, for me, if the next Fire Emblem came out and they were like, all right, we brought the base back, I would be ecstatic. But I do think a lot of people would actually probably miss the hubs that we've had in the last couple games.
Yeah, and I think we can see the sort of lack of more mainstream. Like, it's weird because I don't think the Fire Emblem series is necessarily like a big series for a lot of stuff, but the lack of mainstream success of Echoes probably means we're in the hub zone for a long time. People like it. There's a lot of people that just like it. And I think with a series like Fire Emblem that's not particularly interested in constant reinvention is going to stick to it.
Yeah, and I know I complain about hubs a lot, and I just complained about hubs a lot. I don't hate hubs. I actually like the monastery for a lot of the reasons I like the base, besides that it takes too long. I wish it took a little less time.
I'm right with you there, like contextually, and especially when we get to Three Houses, when we talk about that one, contextually, I think that game as a hub makes the most sense. You know what I mean? So I don't mind spending time in that world, because it's like Persona Emblem, you know, like it's kind of the whole point. You're that, like, building these connections, being in school, or like the Harry Potter of Fire Emblems, or however you want to view it. But when you have hubs like Engage, for me, where it's just so highly fantastical, and you know, it's just really there to fill time or scratch that like silly itch, or, oh, this is something that we had in the last game but we don't know how to make it fit, but we're still going to keep it anyway. I don't enjoy that as much. So this approach in Path of Radiance, I would prefer, kind of like what you're saying, where it's here, we have it, but is the most stripped down, just so you're getting exactly what you need. It makes the most sense to me.
Yeah, I'm just a brevity fan. I'm a hub hater, and I'm not going to lie about it.
Well, especially from a streaming standpoint, too. Like, hubs suck, don't they?
Three Houses Monastery sucks for streaming. Yeah, I hate it.
Yeah.
Like, I like it a lot better when I'm playing on my own than when I'm playing on stream.
Yeah, but I also just like quick. I like being able to move briskly through stuff. So even if I'm playing by myself, I don't like all of the. I just don't get into it. It's just not me. Before we move on, though, there is one thing I want to mention really quick, because we've talked a lot about the bass and the writing and the quality of the story and everything, and I want to emphasize, I think, the trait of Path of Radiance to me that makes it really so effective is that I think, especially now in the age of Fates and Engage and Three Houses that are very verbose, they have long cutscenes with lots of dialogue, is that Path of Radiance is the peak of the series, getting a ton of value out of really small amounts of writing, especially relative to the rest of the series. So one of the big early game spoilers that everybody knows is Ike's dad dies. He's killed by the Black Knight. He doesn't get to have it his way, and unfortunately, we're with Ike when Grail is dying, and I think, yeah, we can draw like a little parallel between this scene and the Alir and Lumera scenes in Engage, because both of those scenes, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but both of those scenes go on for a very extended amount of time, like 4 or 5 minutes. Ike and Grail share roughly 12 lines with each other before Grail dies. And Ike's final line right before Grail dies is a little longer. Stay a little longer. And I think with those 7 words, that more emotionally is done in those 7 lines than any drawn out extended death sequence in the later games has ever done, whether it's Lumera, whether it's Emerin, whether it's Makoto, or the big line of parents that fall in Revelation, or Scarlet. I think this game really understands that it's better to have a few good words than a bunch of mediocre words. And that scene always stands out to me because it's over in a flash and it just hits you like a truck.
Yeah, all I can say is that's rough, buddy. Like, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head, and I think, yeah, I believe you said in our Sacred Stones episode that narratively we're probably just not going to see what we want to see in future Fire Emblems. I wonder if it's just because everything is just so overproduced now. How did they manage? What is it about that like peak era of games where all of these entries, whether we're talking about like Castlevania, Final Fantasy, like there's so many series where there's this like pinnacle era, but then they just like lose it. Like what happens? Because it's sad.
I mean, I still like a lot of I like a lot of the modern Fire Emblem games.
But does it hit you? Because I agree with Bopper. Like, losing Grail was pretty heavy compared to losing virtually anyone else.
I would say the two Grail is better than both of these, to be clear. But the 2 parent deaths that did hit for me were Emerin and Gerald. And I think the reason those worked better for me than like Lumera or Mikoto, and this is also part of why Grail works so well and why they can do that, like they can give you those 7 words that hit so hard, is because they lay the groundwork beforehand, right? Lumera's death has to be really long because we've known Lumera for 4 seconds. So the whole relationship and emotion of that scene has to be established in that scene because it hasn't been established beforehand.
Fair.
Yeah.
But with Grail, we see the relationship, right? We see the love, the care. We feel that something bad is going to happen in that scene, or at least I did, right? Like you're kind of getting bad vibes before the bad stuff happens. So whereas they just don't do that in some of the more recent ones. Like, we don't know Corrin's relationship with Mikoto at all, right up until she dies, right?
Right. Revelation is the worst because they introduce parents in the same cutscene that they kill them 4 chapters in a row. But the Geralt one, I do want to just say the Geralt one is excellent, partially because of a formal decision that Three Houses makes. It's really interesting, which is keeping Geralt as the narrator beyond his death, which I think adds a ton to it. Like, it's never addressed in universe, because not everything needs to be addressed in universe. It's like, it's this reverb through the story that just keeps trickling back in. It brings you back to it every time you go between chapters and you hear his voice narrate, what's going on.
I don't even know if I realized that. I don't know if I paid enough attention to that. Yeah, obviously Gerald's a great character too. Maybe what you're saying is just, how authentic the relationship is generates like how difficult the loss is going to be.
Yeah, because like, even if you wrote Lumera's death scene the exact same way as Grail's, right? Like, it wouldn't hit as hard because there isn't what came before it.
We've been with her for 2 chapters.
Well, also too, I'm wondering if it's because these people are, whether the other characters were immortal or immortal, like their standing of like, well, you are the high priestess or you are the dragon versus you're a mercenary, like you are just like a humble mercenary. Maybe you had something special happen to you in your life at one point, but it's not like so obscene that you're this like godlike figure.
Yeah.
So it's a lot like losing your own parent as opposed to losing this like hugely fantasy parent.
Yeah, it definitely doesn't help that like Alir and Corrin are like the epitome of the meme. Nah, but the dick eating crazy though, because every scene is just over them. Whereas Ike is getting into scraps with, Soren. Well, Ike and Grail fight. Like, they fight, and Grail has to, like, reprimand him multiple times.
Well, and you have guys in your army that don't like Ike. I mean, Shinon and Gatry leave because they're like, Ike's not going to command us. We're just not going to be in this army if that's what the situation is.
Yeah, there's serious consequences to Grail dying, not just for Ike as a person, but Ike as a leader.
Did you just call me a gay tree?
Well, that is a scene in Radiant Dawn where someone tells Gatry, I don't remember who it is, but they get mad at him and they're like, Gatry, you would they're basically like, you'd fuck a tree if it had a skirt on.
I think it's Shinon that says that.
Because Shinon is an unbelievable hater.
Yeah, I mean, back to those characters, I don't know. There's just, though we were talked about in the Sacred Stones episode, that whole like building a character into betrayal, and we kind of get a little bit of a betrayal of these characters in this game leaving. I know that was a kind of shocking thing, but maybe you can anticipate it happening based on their attitude. I love that conflict, and I think that's maybe one of the hard things about I don't want to say tactics games because I can't speak for all of them, but at least for the Fire Emblem series, where once a unit is a unit, they're a unit. Like they are there. They don't leave. I think Matthew leaves once in Fire Emblem 7 because not even because he's technically meeting with, what's his name?
Talking about during Lin mode?
Yeah, he leaves for like one chapter.
To meet with Ostia.
Thank you. Yeah, and so like we don't really see these characters are leaving for a chunk of time, and I think you could build more tension if we saw something like this a little bit more, and I think that's another reason why Path of Radiance succeeds.
Yeah, like and I guess that might be a good place to maybe, I don't know.
No, I think you're right. Like, I think this is a good place to segue into Radiant Dawn, because like that is Radiant Dawn in terms of at least mechanically, right?
The last thing I wanted to leave off on was, like you said, like, how did they see it and then they didn't? I don't think they've completely lost it, but like sometimes that just happens with artists and with companies. You have it and then the inspiration goes. I just wanted to say, within one calendar year, within a 365-day span, Intelligent Systems released Paper Mario Thousand Year Door, Sacred Stones, and Path of Radiance, all within about a 10-month span. So sometimes it just happens.
Guys, I guess some just nail it.
I did live through that, but I didn't realize I didn't even realize that was a 1 year period.
Yeah, they also dropped 2 WarioWare games in that span as well.
Wow.
Yeah, WarioWare Twisted, WarioWare Touched, and if we expand outwards, within a 13-month span, they also released Advanced Wars Dual Strike.
Oh, love that game.
Yeah.
All right, well, hopping on to... Is this technically our final sequel game? Like, I know we had the...
New Mystery.
But
that's a remake.
That's a remake. I know we didn't even get that.
You don't count Hopes, I guess.
Hopes.
Three Hopes.
3 Hopes.
Oh, 3 Hopes.
The Warriors game. It's called Fire Emblem, and it's a sequel. You gotta count it.
Okay, fine. How about this? This is
But it doesn't have a number, though.
The last
it's
sequel?
not mainline.
Yeah, it's not. The fan base didn't artificially give it a number. Intelligent Systems probably refers to it as like FE23 internally, because they count BS Emblem and Heroes as mainline entry. So
I was
going to
say, don't we know what games they consider mainline? Because that's how we know Heroes is considered mainline for whatever that matters, right?
I know in the big FE1 like collector's edition book when they re-released it, they count Heroes and BS Fire Emblem as mainline games, and they count Cypher as a game too. So like, they're very proud of everything.
So strange.
Yeah,
but I mean, one game that we definitely know is game is Radiant Dawn, and
Radiant Dawn is game.
I feel you heard it here first. I feel like this one is a little bit more polarizing, but maybe that's just because of how successful Path of Radiance is. And I know, Bopper, you recently, like you said, you've played through the Final Fantasies, and you did 4, correct? I know you went to 5, but did you end up doing 4?
I've played 1 through 4, 6, and 7.
4 has a sequel, which is unfortunate. And like, sometimes when I play, because they came out in the West around the same time, believe it or not, Radiant Dawn and the after years Final Fantasy 4. It's interesting. I can't imagine the pressure of making a direct sequel, especially off of a game that's so successful. But where does this one land for you guys? Because obviously it's not going to land as high as Path of Radiance. Or for you, Bopper, it can't.
No.
Yeah, I like Path of Radiance a little better. I prefer Radiant Dawn's gameplay.
Is that because it's like snappier? Because I mean, like, Bopper, you had a full-on video essay about how you can make snakes or steaks during some of the chapters or enemy phases.
This is true. I do have. This is. I completely forgot that I had a.
I will never forget that.
In my enemy phase only Path of Radiance video, that I cook a steak in the middle of an enemy phase to completion, but.
You probably don't see it because chat's always going nuts when you're playing, but anytime you have animations on when you're playing a Path of Radiance, as soon as I sign on, the first thing I say is, how many steaks have you made today?
Yes, I don't want to interrupt Lizard's answer, but long enemy faces in Path of Radiance. Jesus Christ.
Yeah. So what I like about Radiant Dawn versus Path of Radiance, one is that I don't know why they locked this to a second playthrough. But on a second playthrough, I can turn off animations.
Quality of life.
That's what you want to call it.
I also just thought that I find that just the gameplay a little more engaging. Particularly Act 1, I really enjoy the Dawn Brigade. I like where you're playing as like this squad of losers trying to fight this army. Losers as units, not as characters.
I'd say both,
where you just have these scrubs and you're like afraid of every enemy. I think it's really fun. Maybe that's why I like Thracia so much too, because Thracia is like that, but for the whole game.
I'm just quivered a little bit because I'm, only a fourth of the way through my first playthrough of that. So thanks for reminding me of that, you asshole.
I thought the bonus XP system was refined in a way that I prefer in this game. However, writing wise, I know a lot of people have them like pretty close. I significantly prefer Path of Radiance writing wise to Radiant Dawn. So that's why I have Path of Radiance over it overall, but I like the gameplay in Radiant Dawn.
Yeah, I agree. We didn't talk about it with Path of Radiance, really. I think Radiant Dawn has a very, very, very strong opening 3 parts. There's 4 parts to the game. I think the first 3 is almost as close to peak Fire Emblem and consistently peak as we see. But I think the tail end of the game, both writing-wise and gameplay-wise, falls off of a cliff as it becomes a sort of prototype for weird revelations that take away all interesting agency from the characters, and then also becoming like enemy spam nightmare maps where you just stick big buff units into flat hallways and they destroy everything. I'm a big Radiant Dawn fan, and then it just falls off a cliff for me.
It's almost like the game can't just be this heavy political intrigue game where we have these nations at war. Like, there has to be an overarching deity that is basically making the whole thing happen.
Because it's not even just the deity. They shy away from the political stuff as soon as they introduce the Blood Pact, right?
Right.
Because that's when they're like, okay, we need a reason for like these 2 armies to fight, but we don't really want you to dislike either of them.
But that is kind of the sad thing, though, because, I think, like you're saying, Bopper, that is when narratively, I think the game kind of goes off the rails, and then mechanically too, just with, or gameplay wise too, just with enemy spam. But I like the game up until then, and I do like the pacing. I'm not the hugest fan of the Dawn Brigade. I mean, like, just because of it being a sequel and leaving off with this like pretty elite group, like, it is more exciting when you get back to the Grail mercenaries and you can see that, some of them have grown, some of them have aged. Like, that is what I would have wanted to see more. But I also get the purpose of, no, we need to bring in some fresh blood just to freshen things up a little bit more too.
Well, but also I remember when the game came out, you didn't know exactly when Ike was going to come back. So, like, for me, playing as, like, the wimpy dudes for a while made it so much cooler when you get to part 3 and you're like, all right, we got the Grail Mercs, we get the good units now. It's, like, such a, like, power upgrade that for me feels good because you have to play the Dawn Brigade first. Or in my case, you get to play the Dawn Brigade because I like the Dawn Brigade.
Well, and it's interesting, too, the way that they structure it, because part 1, Ike's not even on the cover of the game. So they're hiding it pretty good. We know he's going to be there, but, like, we don't know the role. We don't know how important. And part 2 gets a lot of flack because it has almost no gameplay continuity with anything else. It's almost like 6 playable cutscenes. I know it's obviously more challenging than that, but it is like separate cutscenes happening with not a whole lot of gameplay. Not a lot of Fire Emblem, like, straight linear growth through the units. But what part 2 does also is it just breaks up your whole army from Path of Radiance. So part 1, you see a handful of returning units like Jill and Zyhark, Taronio. But then in, like, part 2, you have, like, Joffrey, Makalov, Astrid, Marcia, Braum, Nephany, and they're just all over the place.
It's kind of exciting.
The army you built up in Path of Radiance is just completely... They're everywhere. They're spread out, and we don't know what's going on with Ike. We don't know, is their army still influential? Are they still powerful? You know, who stayed with them? Why did it break up?
It's almost like the exact, like what you like seeing in other games happening in Fire Emblem, and like them just telling you to make do. Like a lot of people hold Final Fantasy 9 in high regard. Have you played that one, Bopper?
Yes.
So like you go through and you are often switching in and out your crew. And not that it's a particularly hard game or anything like that, but it's exciting when all of a sudden something drives a wedge between your characters and it's like, okay, you have the mage squad, like go and make do. And that's kind of how I felt about this. Like one chapter you literally have Braum and Nephedy. One chapter you literally have Alencia and Marcia and
Har.
Har, that's right, and Har. Like make do, figure it out, switch up how you're playing this game, because you don't get to just stomp anymore, right? Like you have to think about how you're going to play it, and it makes you more strategic, and I think it makes for a better game in that way. Maybe I do like this game a little bit more than I thought I did.
Yeah, it's fun when you talk about it. Also on Final Fantasy IX, Steiner needs the fattest blunt in human history. That guy has got to chill out.
Oh man.
Well, I also think part 2 builds up to. Maybe I wouldn't feel this way if I played it now, but when I was a kid, the Grail Mercs returning at the end of part 2 was peak fiction to me. I was like, this is the greatest cutscene I've ever seen and the greatest cutscene I ever will see. And now I watch it again and you get like the funny Radiant Dawn voice acting, the Soren, always lost in your books.
Form up, surround them all.
But when I was a kid, it was amazing. I was like, oh my God.
Yeah. Big fan of the voice acting. Okay, the cutscenes in Radiant Dawn they're tough. Like they look better than a lot of Three Houses cutscenes. They look better than Echo's cutscenes. Like the voice acting, it's to wings, brothers, keep up with me if you can, or interesting maneuver. Like there's like it's the production value's not there on the voice front, but man, those cuts when I'm blanking on his name. Big dude with the big sword, who says "interesting maneuver." during that.
Zelgius.
What's his name? Zelgius. When Zelgius and Ranulf are like, fighting and they're showing down, and like the overcast sky and the sun is like ripping through the horizon, and you just sort of see their silhouettes. Like that's tough. That's tough. Radiant Dawn goes hard in moments like that.
So that's why I'll always love part 2. It is kind of a funky assortment of maps, but I thought they did a really nice job building up to the return of Ike and making that moment so memorable.
Yeah, and really only one of them's tedious, and that's Joffrey's Charge, and that's just because there's a million guys.
What's the story with you and Alencia's Gambit, Bopper? Is that like one of your favorite maps?
I did the video analyzing Alencia's Gambit because my patrons voted on it as the map for me to do.
Okay, so that is literally the only... Okay.
That is it.
So what do you think of that map?
I really like that map to a certain extent. It is sort of a frustrating map on repeat playthroughs, because once you see how you can do it with zero resistance, it's very difficult to not do that. Like the easiest way to beat that map is to undeploy everyone except for Alencia and just park her on the throne and she won't die. But that's boring and it's awful and it's terrible. So it's like it's a self-directed challenge, and your capacity, I think the quality of that map is entirely determined on the player's capacity to extrinsically want to
thing.
Yeah, the extrinsic value of doing things other than just winning to win.
Yes, I agree. I think first playthrough that map is gold.
Yes.
But now when I play it, I'm like, do I have the willpower not to two-turn the map with Har?
Yeah.
But it's really cool the first time.
Or did you play an Iron Man where you forgot that Har just straight up leaves?
Oh my god, that was so funny. That was so funny.
If you're not standing right there, he's gone, and then you don't have him ever again. What a legend. Heart
Literally,
was so real for that one.
That is one of the best moments in Fire Emblem streaming history. I was pissing myself when that happened to you. That
I was so mad.
Hysterical. I feel like chat did you dirty too, didn't you? Didn't they say that he'd stick around and it'd be fine, or he'd talk?
Yeah.
And no,
yeah, or he'd
not.
come for me, and I was ready to go down and flip the breaker to the house so that the run was technically not tainted. So, like,
so many memes. I also want to talk about too. One thing I thought was cool. So obviously, you have we're seeing different aspects of the story through different squads as you go. And for all the griping we do about the last part, and how it's just a ton of enemies. One thing I did think was cool, though, is how you do have to form 3 separate squads at the end. Do you guys like that part? Because I think it really makes you have to think about your balancing, and you can't rely on the same strategy anymore. But yeah, you guys go ahead. Let me know.
I love the separating the armies part and picking who goes where. I wish they were going to better maps. But I like splitting them up.
They're not going to good design, that's for sure.
Yeah, operating that menu sure is fun. Then once you have to deal with the consequences of your actions, it's not so much.
One of the chapters is a defend Fog of War, right?
Oh yeah, we eat defend Fog of War for breakfast. What are you talking about? Those are the best maps. Defend Route is where it's actually at.
Map.
Yeah.
Actually, I kind of do love the Merlinus map. I'm not going to lie.
I do too. But I wish narratively there was better reason for everything. I wish the maps were better. Part 4 of Radiant Dawn suffers from what I think may be the most insulting thing that you can ever say positively about any work of art, which is, well, conceptually, it's very interesting. Like,
yeah, it's like when people say something, oh, it had so much potential, and I'm like, that's like what you say when a thing isn't very good.
This is what I tell to, like, children that write bad essays. Like, wow, the brownie points here are out of control.
Yes, the ending of Radiant Dawn frustrates me, because I can live with the first Blood Pact. I don't love it, but I can live with it. I cannot live with Nesala's Blood Pact. I hate it.
Refresh me, because it has been a little bit for this one.
At the end of Radiant Dawn, you find out that, like, a bunch of the bad stuff Nesala did was because he had a blood pact, and he resolves it, and then he's like, now I'm nice enough that I can marry Leanne and the audience won't feel weird about it.
Okay.
Yeah, Radiant Dawn...
Or retconning.
We see... Well, we're not retconning, we're explaining away. It still happened, but it wasn't so bad. You don't have to feel bad about it. Radiant Dawn is where we really start to see the DNA that will ultimately be birthed disgustingly with Fates start to emerge in Intelligent Systems treatment of the series. I think Radiant Dawn is where we see really the beginning of this being a super risk-averse series, and I don't know where that comes from. I don't know if it's because Shining Force died and there's no competitor to Fire Emblem in any space whatsoever. I don't know what it is.
Bopper? Bopper.
Yes.
How fucking dare you talk about Shining Force dying on my channel?
It's dead. It died. And
I'm going to go cry in the corner now.
We will mourn it every day.
Shining Force 2 is the first tactics RPG I ever played. It is one of my favorite games of all time. How
well, hey, it's
dare
on
you?
Switch now.
Yes. It's on Switch. It's also on the Sega Genesis collection you get for like $6. Shining Force 1 and 2.
You say that like I don't have like 3 different versions of that.
God, I love those late game Shining Force maps. Anyway, because they predict birthright maps, but this is Fire Emblem is a very risk averse series now, where I feel like they don't want to put the player in any kind of uncomfortable situation. This is a series that wants the player to feel loved and feel good and feel cozy. Radiant Dawn does not set that up, but it certainly ends that way, because I think if you took Radiant Dawn's story to its natural conclusion without introducing any like surprise blood packs or hand waving away of complicated characters, this should just end in a bloodbath where the characters that we have spent 2 games getting to know just all kill each other. And I think it's a series that does not want to do that. And so they sort of staple everything on at the end. Because the most interesting part of this game as a sequel is its recontextualization of Path of Radiance. Because Path of Radiance is like a pretty straightforward adventure story. And then Radiant Dawn is like, oh, wait, we destroyed an entire country. And regardless of whether or not they were the aggressors or the weird vassal state of this gigantic empire, like we trashed them, and now we've effectively colonized them, and we have to live with the consequences of that. And I think that's really interesting, and it's what makes the Dawn Brigade so interesting. But then at the end, everyone's got to hold hands and be happy and love each other, and it's very unfortunate because this is a series that does not want you having to actually seriously potentially maybe have to kill Ike or Boyd or any of these people.
Yeah, I think you just kind of reminded me of the ending of the Game of Thrones TV series, where we were all expecting this huge bloodbath and who's going to die, who's not going to make it through, make the characters' lives a little more meaningful through their deaths. And none of that happened, really. There was very little loss, and everybody just left kind of feeling meh about the entire thing.
Yeah. Just imagine if you had to train Micaiah the whole way through the game because you simply needed to, because you had to do it to beat the game, and then you just end up killing her anyway with Ike. Everyone would feel so bad, and it'd be very good.
Well, friends, I hope we did it justice. I know it's impossible to talk about all of the great things that both of these entries have done. We literally could go on for hours, but I think we did a pretty good job. Don't you guys think?
I think so.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Well, again, I want to thank you both for being here, Professor Bopper and ActualLizard. It is always great having your expertise on these. And I think I heard maybe, Bopper, you're coming back for Shadow Dragon and New Mystery. Is that right?
If you're gonna have me back, yes, because I'm fascinated by those games.
I'm definitely gonna need to do a replay of New Mystery, but yes, it's happening. And I think, Lizard, you said you're probably gonna nail one down too.
Yeah, Shadow Dragon I'm very familiar with. I don't think my opinion has ever 180'd on a game so hard as Shadow Dragon in the last 3 years. New Mystery I've only played once. I'll definitely need to give that a replay.
So that is coming in the pipeline. But for now, make sure that you give our friends a follow on their respective YouTubes. And if you like what we're doing here, make sure you sound off on our Twitter, Instagram, or Discord. Remember, because we're talking about Fire Emblem, and sometimes you guys are just the most wonderful community, if you don't agree with us, that is totally okay. It is okay to have differing opinions. Make sure you spread the love. As usual, we want to thank you for listening. Now go out there and get gaming.